clinical trial is when we follow a group of patients very, very closely, and that group of patients are all treated in a controlled fashion, for want of a better expression. So all the patients are treated following a schedule or a protocol where we dictate exactly what should happen at each time point. And it's important to do that because then that helps us really find out how good a drug may be. So when we have a new drug, we'll decide that we're going to treat a group of patients, we'll treat them all exactly the same, and by doing that we can then say this drug works and we know that it will work in this number of patients. Clinical trials can be developed, I guess, in two main ways. One of the first ways will be with the drug company who've designed the drug, designing a study to really test that their drug is working well. And often when a drug company are in that position, they'll discuss their study design with the doctors and the experts that treat the disease. And more commonly now, the drug companies are also discussing their study design with patients, because they're aware that they may come up with a great drug and a great schedule, but actually it really doesn't fit with a patient's quality of life and a patient's lifestyle. So that's one set of clinical trials. The other set of clinical trials are trials which are actually usually designed by the doctors themselves. And sometimes the doctors may have an idea about how they think the drug might be used best. And so they'll design a study to really test whether that drug might be the best way of either delivering the drug or putting the drug with another drug which they think might be a good idea. The phase 1 study tends to be a small study where you're really looking to look at the safety of the drug. And so in that study, it's often maybe 20 or 30 patients. And those patients will be usually given a drug where we know that it works in the laboratory, but we're not entirely sure whether it will work in a patient or indeed how safe it is in the patient. And so we'll look at a small group of patients and really check that the drug is safe and hopefully get a hint that it's going to work well. A phase 2 study is the next study in the step of studies, and in that study we'll look at a bigger group of patients, so maybe 50 or 100 patients, and in that study we'll again be looking at the safety of the drug, but also looking to see how well the drug works. The next stage in the study cycle is called a phase 3 study, and that tends to be a much bigger study, so maybe 400 patients, something like that. And in that situation, we'll compare our new drug to maybe one of the older drugs which we routinely use in clinical practice. And the idea of that study is to see whether the drug may be better or safer than our old previous therapies. So I think it's really important when a patient decides they'd like to take part in a clinical trial that they understand exactly what they're committing to. And so part of the process is what we call informed consent. And that is where the doctor and the nurses and the rest of the clinical study team will discuss the whole study with the patient and make sure that they understand why they're taking part in the study, what that will mean to them. In some instances, it may be meaning having extra tests or needing extra hospital visits. But also, they maybe understand what some of the benefits of being in a study may be. For instance, it might be that you get access to a new drug that maybe you couldn't get otherwise, but also maybe some of the disadvantages of being in the study, which, as I mentioned, might mean that you have to go to hospital every month to get the study drug, rather than every 2 months if you weren't on the study. And so it's really important that when a patient takes part in a study, that they understand exactly what they're committing to. Usually when we do informed consent, we have an information sheet which we give to the patients, and we encourage them to not only ask questions to their doctor and their nurses, but also take the informed consent sheet home and chat with their family and their friends. Because sometimes when you're in the clinic, you don't think of important questions to ask. And the doctors and the nurses are very, very happy to answer those. And so it's a good idea to take it home, have a chat with everybody, and then come back a couple of days later or a week later and rediscuss it and just make sure that going in a clinical study is the right thing for you. I think there's two main advantages. The first one is you often get treated as a very special patient, okay, a VIP, because when you're in a clinical trial, you need to be seen regularly and you need to be checked regularly. And so you'll usually be assigned a nurse who will make sure that you are receiving your treatment correctly and that everything is going well. But apart from that, often one of the advantages of being in a clinical trial is that you maybe will get the new and the latest treatment, which often the doctors will think is going to be an advance. We're not 100% sure when we're doing the clinical study, but it may be that you have access either to a new treatment you couldn't have before, or maybe to a new way of giving the treatment. I think there are a number of risks of participating in a clinical trial. Clearly, with the drugs that we use every day in the clinic, we know lots and lots of things about them. When we're looking at a new drug, we don't know everything about them. And so there may be the rare, unusual side effect that occurs. And so that's clearly one of the risks, that unfortunately the patient might be a patient who gets that unusual side effect. That risk is actually mitigated to some extent by the doctors and the nurses keeping a very close eye on the patients and making sure that the patient has good communication with their team so that should they develop any problems, they can get advice very quickly. I think the other risk is that often you need to come to the clinic slightly more often, and so it's more of a, I was going to say, an inconvenience rather than a risk. Many hospitals will have clinical trials open, and if a patient is interested in taking part in a clinical trial, they should ask their doctor or their nurse which clinical trials are open in their hospital. Usually the hospitals are linked together, and certainly within Europe, the hospitals usually will know if they don't have a clinical trial appropriate in their own hospital. They usually have a good network and know which studies are open in other hospitals in the area, so would maybe be able to refer a patient on to a different area. There's also quite a lot of links on the internet. So Myeloma Patients Europe are developing a link of a comprehensive list of the clinical trials, but other sites such as Myeloma UK and some of the US sites as well will have a list of where those clinical trials are happening, so that you can get in contact and find out which are appropriate. In an ideal world, however, it would be your doctor that would be saying, "Hey, I've got this clinical trial, would you like to participate?" At the moment, there's lots of excitement about a new kind of drug called an antibody. And there are a number of different antibodies for myeloma patients that are being developed. And what these drugs do, they're targeted drugs, so they hopefully just kill off the myeloma cells themselves and don't cause too many side effects by killing off any of the normal tissues. And so there's a number of clinical studies going on in Europe at the moment looking at the effect of these antibodies. The most widely used antibody at the moment is one called anti-CD38, but there are about 3 or 4 other antibodies that are also being explored. In addition to the antibodies, there's some newer drugs, so there's newer versions of bortezomib which are being looked at. Both ones which are given as an infusion, but also some bortezomib-like drugs which are given as a tablet. And those studies, again, are quite widespread in Europe. So I think a lot of people have got a lot of hope for those two kinds of studies.